The more they pulled away, the harder the world shattered. Stone cracked, glass broke. The magic demanded what their hearts refused to admit. Two enemies, one bond, no escape. The story unfolds now. The castle had not stopped bleeding magic, even months after the last curse fell. Hermione felt it the moment she stepped into the eastern undercroft. That low, arrhythmic thrum beneath the flagstones, like a heart that had forgotten its proper time. The torches here burned a sickly blue where the war fire had scorched the wardstones, and the air carried the metallic sharpness of spent spellwork, the scent of ozone that never quite cleared from the lower halls. She drew her cloak tighter. The grain of the old oak door had splintered under her palm when she pushed it, and a hairline of light still seeped from the crack, as though the wood itself could not hold its shape. McGonagall stood at the centre of the chamber, beside a circle of runes etched so deep into the floor they seemed to swallow the torchlight rather than reflect it. "You're prompt," the headmistress said. "Good. We have a narrow window before the Nexus destabilizes further." Hermione's eyes moved past her to the far side of the circle, and the warmth she'd carried down the stairs left her all at once. He was already there. Draco Malfoy stood with his back half-turned, his pale hair catching the blue light, one hand braced against the cold stone of the wall. He did not look at her. He had perfected, over the past year, the art of not looking at her, a discipline so total it had become its own kind of attention. She knew the shape of his refusal, the way she knew the shape of an old wound. "Granger," he said to the wall. "Malfoy." The single word cost him something. She heard it in the way his jaw set afterward, in the small muscle that tightened beneath the sharp line of his cheek. He had grown leaner since the trials. There was a hollowness about him now that she refused to find anything but irritating. "Headmistress," Hermione said, turning deliberately away from him. "You said the ward nexus needed 2 anchors. You did not say who the second would be." "Because the castle chooses, Miss Granger, not I." McGonagall's voice was clipped, but beneath it ran a thread of unease that Hermione had never heard from her before. The anchoring rite reads magical resonance. It pairs by the depth of the answer one's signature gives another. I ran the diagnostic 4 times. I had hoped. She stopped. It returned the same result each time. And the result is... Hermione already knew. She felt the knowledge arrive in her chest like cold water. "The 2 of you." For a moment, no one spoke. The torches guttered. Somewhere above them, faint and far, a pane of glass cracked, and a thin trickle of sound came spiraling down the stairwell. "Absolutely not," Draco said. He had turned at last, and the full force of his attention struck her. Grey eyes gone flat and hard, his arms folded across his chest as though to keep something inside him from spilling out. "Resonance. You're telling me the castle has decided that she and I..." He bit the sentence in half. A flush had risen high on his throat, and he reached up and adjusted the collar of his shirt, though it sat perfectly already, his fingers worrying the fabric with a precision that betrayed everything his face was trying to hide. "I find it no more agreeable than you do," Hermione said, and was proud of how level she kept her voice, even as her own pulse hammered against the bones of her wrist. "How comforting!" "The alternative," McGonagall cut in, "is that this nexus fails entirely. If it fails, the wards anchored to it fail. If those fail, every protective enchantment laid into this castle since its founding unravels in a single night. I should not have to explain to either of you what that would mean for the children sleeping 3 floors above us. The silence that followed had weight. Hermione looked down at the runes. She understood the theory. Anchoring was old magic, blood deep and stubborn, predating wands and incantations both. To anchor a nexus was to lend it the steadiness of a living signature, to give the fractured magic a heartbeat to follow until it could keep its own again. It was meant to be done by those whose magic ran calm and concordant. She and Malfoy were the least concordant pair in Britain. "How long?" she asked. "Until the nexus self-stabilizes. Days, perhaps longer." McGonagall's mouth thinned. "The rite will tell us more once it takes." "And if we refuse?" "Then I find another way, and the castle stands undefended while I search." The headmistress let that settle. "I will not order you, but I am asking." Draco said nothing. Hermione watched him, watched the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his gaze had dropped to the floor and would not rise. She thought of all the reasons to walk back up the stairs and never return. And then she thought of the first years, of the ordinary cruelty of a roof coming down on someone who had done nothing but survive a war they were too young to have fought. "Tell me what to do," she said. Draco's head came up sharply. For one unguarded instant, something crossed his face. Surprise, and beneath it, something she could not name, before the shutters came down again. "Granger, tell me what to do, headmistress." McGonagall exhaled. "Step into the circle, both of you, opposite points, wands lowered. This rite does not require them, and it will not tolerate the threat of them." Hermione stepped over the carved boundary. The runes flared faintly as she crossed, a warmth rising through the soles of her boots that was almost gentle. Across from her, after a long and deliberate hesitation, Draco crossed too. The light beneath their feet brightened, threading between them in slow filaments of gold. "Now," said McGonagall, "you must each speak the binding. The words matter less than the will behind them. You must consent to be anchored, to lend your steadiness to the other and to receive theirs." She paused. "I will not pretend this is comfortable. It is not meant to be." "What are the words?" Draco asked, his voice very low. "I hold and am held." The chamber seemed to lean inward to listen. Hermione met his eyes across the circle. This close, in the gold light, she could see the faint tremor running through him. Not fear exactly, but something near it, something old and held very tightly. She wondered absurdly when she had learned to read him at all. She wondered why the reading of him did not feel like victory. "I hold," she said, "and am held." The gold filaments leapt toward her, sinking into her sternum with a warmth that spread outward like the first swallow of something strong. She gasped despite herself. Draco was staring at her, his throat working. His hands had curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles gone bloodless and white, and she understood that he was at war with himself in a way she had no map for. "Malfoy," McGonagall said, "the bond reads consent, not coercion. It will not take if you do not mean it. And if it does not take tonight, I cannot promise the Nexus will hold until I find you a replacement." He closed his eyes. When he spoke, the words came out rough, as though dragged. "I hold," he said, "and am held." The light detonated. It was not pain. That was the strange thing. The thing Hermione would turn over in her mind for hours afterward. It was the opposite of pain. It was the sudden, dizzying sensation of a missing weight settling into place, of a note she hadn't known was sour resolving into harmony. The gold flooded up through her chest, behind her ribs, and reached, she could think of no other word for it, reached across the circle toward him, and she felt, with horror and with something far more dangerous than horror, the exact moment his magic answered hers. It was not a stranger's magic. That was the unbearable part. It knew her. It fit against the contour of her own, like a hand finding the hollow it had been carved for. Then the light dimmed, and they were simply two people standing in a cold undercroft, breathing too hard. "It's taken," McGonagall said quietly. "Merlin, help us all. It's taken." Draco staggered back a step, dragging a hand down his face. What was that?" "You are anchored," the headmistress said, "to the Nexus, and through it, to one another. The binding is settled. Now." She straightened her robes, and Hermione caught the relief beneath her composure. "You will both return to your quarters and rest. The rite is taxing. We will begin the stabilization work in the morning, when you've—" "No." Draco was already moving, already crossing the boundary of the circle and striding for the stairs, his cloak snapping behind him. "No, I've done your ritual. I've said your words. I am not staying down here to— Mr. Malfoy." He reached the foot of the staircase, and the world buckled. Hermione felt it before she understood it. A wrongness that started behind her breastbone, exactly where the gold had sunk, and bloomed outward into a sound like a struck bell pitched too low for hearing. The torches along the walls stretched, their flames pulling sideways toward the far end of the chamber, as though something had opened a great mouth and begun to breathe in. The floor shuddered. A fine dust sifted from the ceiling. Draco froze on the third stair, one hand white-knuckled on the banister. "What is that?" he said. "What is— Granger, what is happening?" She couldn't answer. The pressure was building behind her ribs, an atmospheric heaviness like the held breath before a storm breaks. And she realized with a lurch that it was worse the farther he climbed. The distance. It was the distance. The two threads of magic that had reached so eagerly for one another were now being stretched, and the strain was bleeding out into the stone, into the air, into the very geometry of the room. "Come back," she heard herself say. "Malfoy, come back. I am not—" He took another stare, defiant to the last, his eyes blazing. The crack of stone was deafening. A fissure shot across the ceiling above McGonagall's head, and a chunk of masonry the size of a cauldron tore free and dropped, and Hermione's wand was in her hand before she had decided to move it, a shield charm flaring up to catch the falling stone an arm's length from the headmistress's skull, and she was screaming his name now, all dignity gone. "Draco, get down here!" And he turned, finally his face stripped of every armor he owned, and looked at her down the length of the trembling chamber as the world came apart in the space he had put between them. He came back down, not gracefully. There was nothing graceful about the way Draco half fell down the last 3 stairs, one hand still clawing the banister, his breath sawing in his throat. But the moment his boots struck the chamber floor, The dreadful low bell note in the air began to ebb. The torches eased upright. The fissure in the ceiling stopped its hungry crawl, leaving a jagged white scar across the ancient stone. The masonry Hermione had caught in mid-fall trembled in the cradle of her shield charm, and she lowered it gently until the chunk of rock settled against the floor with a thud that she felt in her teeth. For a long moment, no one moved. McGonagall stood with one hand pressed flat against her own sternum, her face the grey of cold ash, staring at the place where the stone had so nearly come down on her. When she spoke, her voice had lost its crispness entirely. "I see," she said. "I see." "You see?" Draco rounded on her, and the fear in him had curdled into something he could use, something with edges. "I nearly brought the ceiling down by walking up a flight of stairs, and you see? What have you done to us? What is this leash?" "Sit down, Mr. Malfoy." "I will not." "You will sit down," McGonagall said, "before you frighten the foundations into dropping the rest of that ceiling on all three of our heads, and you will let me think." He sat, hard on the low stone lip of the rune circle, his elbows on his knees and his head dropping into his hands, his pale hair sliding through his fingers. Hermione watched the breath move through him in great unsteady heaves, and found, to her deep annoyance, that her own hands were shaking too. She crossed the chamber. She noted distantly that with every step she took toward him, the air grew lighter, the pressure behind her ribs uncoiling by degrees, and lowered herself onto the stone an arm's length from him. Not close, but not far. The relief was immediate and humiliating. Some knot beneath her breastbone, drawn tight since the moment the gold light took, loosened the instant she settled within reach of him. He felt it too. She watched it happen, watched the rigid line of his spine ease a fraction, watched his shoulders come down from around his ears, and watched the precise instant he noticed the relief and hated it, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle leapt beneath the skin. "It's the distance," Hermione said quietly. "Isn't it, headmistress? The farther apart we are, the worse it gets." McGonagall had drawn her own wand and was tracing slow diagnostic figures in the air above the rune circle. Threads of silver light hung where she drew them, twisting into shapes Hermione half recognized from the oldest texts in the restricted section. The headmistress studied them with her mouth pressed flat. "Their anchoring did not merely bind you to the nexus," she said at last. "It bound your two signatures into a single resonant pair and routed the nexus's stability through the concord between you, the harmony." She let the silver threads dissolve. "When you are near and at ease with one another, your signatures sit in accord. The nexus draws steadiness from that accord. It quiets. The castle quiets." "And when we're not near," Hermione said, "when you withdraw, in body, or—" McGonagall's eyes flicked between them. "In spirit, the concord strains. And that strain has to go somewhere. It bleeds into the stone, the wards, the shape of the rooms." She gestured at the white scar overhead. "You are not merely anchored to the castle. You have become a fault line running through it. And every time you pull against each other, the ground shakes." The words dropped into the cold air and lay there. Draco lifted his head from his hands. His eyes, when they found Hermione's, were rimmed red with exhaustion and something raw underneath. "So, we are to be—" "What?" "Kept within arm's reach of one another. For days. caged together because some half-dead ritual decided our magic. He spat the next word like it tasted of rot. Rhymes. I am working on the limits, McGonagall said. How far you may safely part, whether the tether will slacken as the nexus heals. I do not yet know. But yes, Mr. Malfoy. For now, you must remain close. Both of you. I have had a room prepared. A room, Draco repeated. Adjoining chambers with a shared sitting room between. The walls are warded thin enough that you should be able to sleep apart without incident. She paused. Provided you do not lie awake stoking your loathing of one another. The bond reads feeling, not merely yardage. I would advise you both to find some measure of peace if you value the people sleeping above you. Draco laughed, a short, broken sound with no humour in it at all. Peace. With her. You might be surprised, McGonagall said dryly, what you can manage when the alternative is killing someone. She turned for the stairs, then stopped and looked back at them with an expression Hermione could not entirely read. Something between pity and a strange, fierce hope. Go up together, slowly, side by side. The castle will tell you if you stray too far apart. Listen to it. And then she was gone, her footsteps fading up the spiral, leaving the two of them alone in the blue-lit undercroft with a scar across the ceiling and a tether neither of them could see strung taut between their ribs. They climbed the stairs together. It was, Hermione thought, possibly the most excruciating walk of her life. And she had walked into the Department of Mysteries at 15, had walked across a courtyard littered with the dead. This was a different order of awfulness. This was the agony of measuring every step against the steps of a man she despised, of feeling the air tighten warningly whenever she drifted half a pace too far ahead, of watching him slow his own long stride to match hers and loathe himself for it. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was their footfalls on the worn stone, his and hers, falling almost into rhythm and then breaking apart, falling in and breaking again. The torches along the spiral burned steadier the closer they kept to one another. She could see the magic responding, could watch the flames go from a guttering blue to a clean gold as the gap between them narrowed. On the 7th floor landing, he stopped so abruptly she nearly walked into him. "This is obscene," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the corridor stretching away before them, at the suits of armour standing sentinel in the dark, at the rain beginning to streak the tall windows in long silver runnels. Do you understand that? Out of everyone, out of every witch and wizard in this entire bloody castle, it had to read you. It had to decide that my magic answers to yours. His voice cracked on the word, and he pressed his lips together as if he could take it back. You think I wanted this? Hermione kept her own voice low, but there was iron under it now. You think I want to be tied at the chest to the boy who stood by while his aunt carved a word into my arm in his own drawing room? The silence after that was absolute. She had not meant to say it. She had carried the words for a year, locked in a place she did not visit, and now they were out in the cold corridor between them and could never be unsaid. She watched the impact land, watched the colour drained from his face, watched something behind his eyes flinch and fold inward, watched his hand rise halfway toward his own left forearm before he caught it and forced it down. He did not defend himself. That was the thing she had not expected. He did not snarl or sneer or fling some cruelty back to even the wound. He simply stood there in the rain light with his jaw working and no sound coming out, and his knuckles whitened where they gripped the windowsill until she thought the stone might crack beneath them. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone very quiet and very flat, scoured of everything. "I know what happened in that room," he said. "I do not need you to tell me." And he turned and walked on down the corridor, slowly, carefully, keeping to the exact distance the tether allowed, so that not a single window pane so much as trembled. The chambers were in a quiet turret on the 8th floor, a round sitting room with 2 narrow doors leading off it to either side. A fire had been lit. The flames threw amber light across 2 armchairs, a low table, a tall window streaming with rain, and the high curved ceiling lost in shadow. It was, Hermione thought, almost beautiful. The kind of room she might have found warm and welcoming under any other circumstance in the world. Draco crossed straight to the door on the right and let himself into his chamber without a word. The door clicked shut behind him. Hermione stood alone in the firelit round room and pressed her hand flat against her sternum, over the place where the gold light had sunk and stayed. She could feel him there. That was the part she could not get past, the part that made her want to scratch her own skin off. She could feel him, a low, warm presence at the edge of her awareness, a second heartbeat she had no permission to hear. Through the wall, through the warded stone, the bond held them both like 2 notes of a chord that refused to be played apart. She went into her own room. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing. The rain came harder against the glass. For a long time she stared at the ceiling and listened to the small sounds bleeding through the wall, the creak of a floorboard, the soft hiss of a fire being stoked. And then, much later, when she had nearly drifted under, a single sound that made her open her eyes in the dark, the low, rough scrape of a breath that had not quite managed to be steady. One, then another. He was not asleep either. He was lying in the next room, awake in the rain dark, carrying whatever he carried. She told herself she did not care. The lie sat in her chest beside the warmth of him, and neither one would let her rest. And outside the great window, the storm came down on the broken castle in long grey sheets, washing the soot from the stones, while 2 people who could not bear each other lay an arm's length and a single wall apart, joined at the breastbone by a magic that knew them better than they knew themselves. And somewhere far below, in the sleeping heart of the school, the cracked wardstones glowed faintly gold and, for the first time in months, went quiet. Morning came grey and rinsed clean, the storm spent, the sky beyond the turret window the colour of pewter. Hermione woke to the unfamiliar warmth at the edge of her awareness, that second presence, low and steady, behind the wall. And for one disoriented moment, before memory caught up to her, she lay still and simply felt it, the way one might lie, listening to distant music without yet knowing the song. Then she remembered and sat up and was furious with herself. She found him already in the round sitting room when she emerged, dressed and severe, her hair scraped back, her armour on. He stood at the tall window with a cup of tea going cold in his hand, watching the grounds below where the lake lay flat and pewter bright. He did not turn when she entered, but she saw the small adjustment in him, the easing of his shoulders, the half-degree settling of his spine, that told her the bond had registered her nearness and approved. "There's tea," he said to the glass. "It's barely drinkable. The house elves left it outside the door. How generous of you to ration it. I poured you a cup." He nodded, still without looking toward the low table, where a second cup steamed gently beside the pot. "Don't read anything into it. The longer you stand there glaring at me from across the room, the more likely the windows are to shatter, and I'd rather not be standing in front of them when they do." Hermione crossed to the table and picked up the cup. It was, in fact, made exactly as she took it, a little strong, no sugar, and the noticing of that small accuracy unsettled her more than open hostility would have. She said nothing. She drank. They were halfway through a silence so taut it hummed when McGonagall arrived, brisk and grim, with a roll of parchment under her arm, and a thin man Hermione did not recognize trailing behind her, robed in the grey of the Ministry's Department of Magical Architecture, with a permanent squint and ink stains on his fingers. "This is Warder Pollux," McGonagall said without preamble. "He has spent the night with the Nexus Diagnostics. He has findings." Pollux unrolled his parchment across the low table, weighting its corners with a teapot and a candlestick, and Hermione leaned in despite herself. The parchment showed the castle in cross-section, drawn in fine silver lines, and threaded through it, root to spire, a tracery of gold. The ward lattice, she realized. Most of it glowed steady, but here and there, at the junctions, the gold ran ragged and frayed, and at the deep heart of the diagram, in the undercroft, 2 points burned brighter than all the rest. "You," Pollux said, tapping the 2 bright points. "Both of you. The anchors." His squint deepened. "I'll be plain, because plainness is what's wanted. The bond will not break. I have tested every severance I know, and several I'd be sacked for knowing, and the magic rejects them all. It rejects them because it does not regard itself as a wound to be closed. It regards itself as," he searched for the word, "correct, as something that ought to exist. The castle is not holding you together against your will. It is holding you together because, by its own lights, you belong held." "That's absurd," Draco said flatly. "It is old magic," Pollux returned, unbothered. "Absurdity is rather its native tongue. The point, young man, is this." He tapped the frayed gold at the junctions. "These breaks are healing. Slowly. The Nexus is knitting itself back together, drawing on your joint signature as call it a splint, a bone setting around a brace. And as it heals, the tether will lengthen. You'll be granted more room. Today, perhaps 10 feet of separation before the strain shows. In a week, a corridor. In a month, who knows? A wing. A floor. Eventually, when the bone is set and the brace no longer needed, perhaps nothing at all." Hermione's heart lifted at that. A way out, an end date, a horizon. "So we wait. We stay close, we let it heal, and eventually it lets us go." "Eventually," Pollux agreed. Then his squint sharpened. "But mark me on this, both of you, for it is the part that matters. The lengthening is not earned by time. It is earned by accord. The bone sets faster the less you fight the brace. Every time you strain against each other, every flare of true hostility, every deliberate withdrawal, you do not merely shake the castle. You set the healing back. You refracture what was knitting. He rolled the parchment up with a snap. So, you may spend these weeks at one another's throats, in which case the tether stays short and tight, and the windows keep breaking, and the children keep being sent to lessons under a ceiling that might fall for a very, very long time. Or you may find a way to stop fighting it. The choice, gentleman and lady, is precisely as unpleasant as it sounds. He bowed to McGonagall, nodded curtly to the two of them, and left. The silence he left behind had a new texture to it. Hermione looked at Draco. Draco looked at the rolled parchment as though it had personally insulted his bloodline. "He's saying," Hermione said slowly, "that the more we hate each other, the longer we're trapped. I can hear, Granger. I was standing here. I'm only making certain you understood the implication." "The implication," Draco said, his voice gone dangerously soft, "is that I am being asked to manufacture fondness for the witch who would happily have watched me hang at my own trial. Forgive me if I struggle to summon it on command. I testified for you." The words stopped him cold. She had not meant to say that either. She seemed, around him, to keep saying the things she had walled away. But it was out, and she would not take it back. She watched it strike, watched his face go very still, the way still water goes before something rises beneath it. "What did you say?" His voice was barely a sound. "At your trial, I gave evidence." Hermione kept her chin level, though her pulse had begun to thud. "That you lowered your wand on the tower. That you didn't identify Harry at the manor when you could have. That you were a frightened boy, not a—" She made herself say it. "Not a murderer." She set down her cup. Her hand was not quite steady, and she hated that it wasn't. And she pressed her palm flat to the table to still it. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was true, and because I'd watched too many people decide that truth didn't matter anymore. So don't stand there and tell me I'd have watched you hang. You don't know the first thing about what I would or wouldn't do." For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The grey light moved across his face. Somewhere below them, the castle settled with a low groan of waking stone. When he spoke, it was not what she expected. "I know," he said. "You know. I read the transcript." His eyes had dropped to the floor. His thumb moved restlessly against the rim of his cup, around and around. "Afterward. They sent me a copy of the proceedings. I read every page of it." He stopped. The thumb stopped. "I know what you said. I know it's the reason I'm standing in this room and not in a cell." Hermione stared at him. "You never said anything." What was I to say? And now he did look up, and the rawness in his face was so naked she nearly looked away from it. "Thank you. To you? After everything that—" He cut himself off. His jaw worked. His knuckles had gone white around the cup, the bones standing out sharp beneath the skin. And she thought, with a strange lurch, that he was holding it the way a man holds onto something to keep from being swept off his feet. There is no version of those words that wouldn't have curdled in my mouth. You'd have thought I was mocking you, or pitying myself, and you'd have been— The smallest, bitterest twist of his lips. You'd have been within your rights. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, a bird crossed the pewter sky, and Hermione felt something shift, not soften, not yet, nothing so generous as that, but shift, A single tectonic inch, the way a door long swollen shut gives the first hair's breadth when you finally put your shoulder to it. She had spent a year building him into a shape she could despise without complication. The man in front of her kept refusing to fit it. "You could try it now," she heard herself say. The words, "There's no one here to think you're mocking me." A silence. His eyes searched her face, looking for the trap. "Thank you," he said, low, reluctant, real. And the strangest thing happened. The bond, that low taut wire strung behind her ribs, loosened. Not all at once, just a degree, just enough to feel like a held breath let slowly out. And from somewhere far below in the foundations of the castle came a sound she had not heard before. A soft, deep, resonant hum, almost like a sigh, as if the ancient stone itself had registered the small accord and approved of it. They both felt it. She saw the recognition flicker across his face, the same startled awareness she knew was on her own. "It heard us," Hermione said. "It heard us," he agreed, and for one disarmed second something almost like wonder crossed his features before he caught it and put it away. They tested the limits that afternoon on McGonagall's instruction, carefully in the long gallery on the 8th floor, with the headmistress watching from a safe distance and Hermione's wand ready in her hand. It went exactly as Pollux had warned. They stood at the centre of the gallery and stepped apart, pace by pace, watching the portraits on the walls for the first sign of strain. At 6 feet, nothing. At 8, the nearest painting, a stern medieval witch on a grey horse, began to ripple, the horse tossing its head, the witch clutching at her frame. At 10 feet, the great window at the gallery's end groaned, a long crack racing up one pane, and the temperature dropped so sharply Hermione saw her own breath. "Stop!" McGonagall called. "Come back together, slowly." They closed the gap and the strain bled away, the window stilling, the painted witch settling her horse with an affronted glare. 10 feet, McGonagall noted, making a mark on her parchment. Better than last night already. Pollux was right. The accord is lengthening it. She looked between them with a thin, assessing expression. "Whatever you said to one another this morning, it helped. I suggest you do more of it." Draco made a sound that might have been a laugh, if it had been allowed to finish. Hermione found, to her own bewilderment, that she had to bite the inside of her cheek not to do the same. They walked back to the turret side by side as the grey afternoon dimmed toward evening, the proper distance between them, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them had changed its character. It was no longer the silence of two enemies enduring one another, but the warier, more dangerous silence of two people who had just discovered the ground beneath their hatred was not as solid as they'd believed. At the door of the round room, Draco paused, his hand on the latch. He seemed to weigh something. Then, without looking at her, in a voice scraped almost to nothing, "For what it's worth," he said, "the word on your arm. I see it." His thumb pressed white against the iron latch. "Every time I close my eyes in that house, I still—" And he stopped himself, the way a man stops at the edge of a drop, and opened the door and went inside without finishing. The days settled into an uneasy rhythm, the way even the strangest captivity will, given enough hours. They learned each other's edges by necessity. Hermione discovered that Draco rose early, that he could not abide noise before he'd had tea, that he read with a frightening intensity, not lazily, the way she'd assumed a Malfoy would read, but with a quill in hand and a furrow between his brows, arguing with the margins. Draco learned that Hermione hummed under her breath when she worked and seemed entirely unaware she was doing it, that she chewed the end of her quill to ruin, that she kept a list of everything, tasks, theories, grievances, he suspected. In a small leather book she guarded like a hippogriff with an egg. They learned to move around one another, to pass the teapot without a word, to read in the same room without the air going brittle. The tether lengthened by inches as they did. 12 feet now, then 15, then nearly 20. And the castle stopped flinching every time one of them crossed a room. But 20 feet was the length of the round sitting room, and no more, and so the evening still found them trapped together in the amber firelight with nowhere to go. It was on the 5th such evening that the silence finally cracked open. Hermione had carried a stack of books up from the library that afternoon. Pollux had granted her access to the restricted section's warding texts, on the theory that she might help speed the Nexus's healing, and she'd seized the chance with both hands. She sat now in the armchair nearest the fire, a heavy volume open across her knees, the firelight catching the gold leaf of its title, Concordances of the Founding Wards. The book smelled of the deep stacks, of dust and beeswax, and the particular dry sweetness of very old vellum, the tooth of parchment that had outlived everyone who'd ever touched it. Across the room, Draco sat in the other chair, ostensibly reading, in fact watching her over the top of his own book with an expression she could feel without looking up. "You're staring," she said, turning a page. "I'm wondering how one person can frown at a book that hard without setting it alight. It's complicated material. What is it?" She nearly didn't answer. Then she thought of Pollux's warning, of a cord, of the bone setting faster the less they fought, and of the small deep hum the castle had given when Draco said thank you, and she found she wanted, perversely, to hear it again. "The original ward magic," she said. "The Founder's work. I'm trying to understand the Nexus, what was done to it, how it's meant to heal." She tilted the book so the firelight fell across the page. "It's beautiful, actually, the way they built it. The 4 of them anchored the wards in pairs, Gryffindor with Slytherin, Ravenclaw with Hufflepuff. They thought the strongest magic came from joining opposites, fire and earth, air and water." She heard the irony arrive a beat before he did, and grimaced. "Don't." I wasn't going to say a word. But the corner of his mouth had tucked inward, and she knew he'd thought it. Fire and earth, lion and snake. The same architecture that had bound the castle was, it seemed, the architecture that had bound the 2 of them. She did not care for the symmetry. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked after a moment, and the mockery had gone out of his voice. "The healing. You could leave it to Pollux. Wait it out. Why bury yourself in this?" She looked up at him then. The fire moved on his face, on the sharp planes of it, gilding the pale hair to bronze. He'd asked it plainly, without an angle, and the plainness disarmed her. "Because I can't bear not understanding a thing that's happening to me," she said. "Because if I understand it, then it isn't being done to me. I'm meeting it. Even if I can't change it, I can." She searched for the word. I can know it, and knowing is the only thing that's ever made me feel less afraid. The silence after that was different. He was looking at her as though she'd said something he recognized, something he hadn't expected to find in her keeping. I used to think that was a Granger affectation, he said slowly. The endless reading, the need to have the answer first, loudest, before anyone else. I thought it was vanity. He turned his own book over in his hands, not seeing it. It never occurred to me it was fear. It's both, she said. Most things are. He huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. And then, quietly, what are you afraid of? Now, with this. It was too direct a question. She should have deflected it. Instead, watching the fire, she heard herself answer with a truth she had not even fully admitted to herself. That it isn't only the magic, she said. The words dropped into the room and lay there, terrible and bare. She felt him go very still across the firelight. She did not dare look at him. Her hand had found the cuff of her sleeve, and she was straightening it, smoothing the already smooth fabric down over her wrist, over the place where the scar lay hidden, her fingers moving in small frantic passes she couldn't seem to stop. What do you mean? He said, low, careful, as though he were afraid of frightening off the answer. I mean that I'd assumed. She forced her hand still. I'd assumed that what I feel when you're near, the ease, the way the breathing comes easier. Her face had gone hot. She kept her eyes fixed on the flames. I'd assumed it was the bond, manufactured, a leash dressed up as comfort. And I've been telling myself that for 5 days, because the alternative is unbearable. She made herself stop. And I'm no longer certain it's true. That's what I'm afraid of, that the magic isn't making me feel anything. That it's only letting me notice what was already there. The fire cracked. A log shifted and settled in a soft cascade of sparks. Draco did not answer for a long time. When she finally looked at him, his face had been stripped of all its usual defenses, and what was underneath was younger and rawer and more frightened than she had ever seen him. Don't, he said. Don't what? Don't say things like that to me. He'd risen from the chair without seeming to decide to. He stood now with one hand braced on the mantel, his back half to her, his knuckles white against the stone. You don't get to say things like that. Not you. Do you understand? Of everyone in the world, you are the last person who is allowed to. His voice broke clean in half. He stopped. His shoulders rose and fell. I have spent a year teaching myself not to think about you. It is the single hardest piece of magic I have ever worked, and it has never once held for a full day. And now they have tied me to your heartbeat and asked me to find a chord, and you sit there in the firelight and tell me it might not be the bond. He turned, and his eyes were bright and furious and wet. Do you have any idea what you're doing to me? Hermione's breath had gone shallow. She rose too, slowly, the book sliding from her knees to the chair, forgotten. 20 feet of room and the fire between them, and she crossed half of it before she knew she'd moved, and the tether sang in her chest, not with strain now, but with something else, a magnetic pull she had stopped pretending not to feel. I'm not doing anything to you, she said. I'm telling you the truth. You said yourself, I'm the one person who'd tell you the truth, even when it curdled in my mouth. This is crueler than a lie. Then tell me I'm wrong. She was close now. Close enough to see the rapid beat of the pulse at his throat. Close enough that the bond had gone almost silent between them. That low, warm presence she'd carried for 5 days, drawing tight and bright and singing. Tell me you feel nothing. Tell me it's only the leash, and I'll believe you, and we'll never speak of it again, and I'll bury it the way I bury everything. Tell me, Draco. He looked down at her. The firelight ran in his pale eyes. His hand had come up. She watched it rise, helpless, as though it belonged to someone else, and his fingers hovered an inch from her face, not touching, never quite touching, trembling in the small, warm space between them. I can't, he said. It was barely a breath. I can't tell you that. God help me, I can't. His fingertips brushed her cheek, the lightest contact imaginable, a single point of warmth, the bite of cool air where his signet ring grazed her skin. And the bond between them went utterly, perfectly still, stiller than it had ever been. A silence so complete and so sweet that Hermione's eyes fell shut, and a sound she would later be mortified by escaped her throat. And then, from the corridor outside, sharp and sudden, came the rap of knuckles on the chamber door and McGonagall's voice. Miss Granger? Mr. Malfoy? I've news from Pollux. And they sprang apart as though scalded, the warmth tearing away, and the moment the distance opened between them, the windows of the round room shuddered in their frames, every pane ringing at once like struck glass. And Draco stood with his hand still half raised, staring at her, his chest heaving, as the knocking came again, and the whole turret trembled around them. McGonagall's news, when they had collected themselves enough to admit her, was both a reprieve and a sentence. Pollux believes the Nexus is stable enough now to attempt the first reinforcement, she said, settling into the armchair Hermione had vacated, apparently oblivious to the way both students were standing too far apart and breathing too carefully and not quite looking at one another. There is a junction on the 3rd floor, one of the worst breaks. If the two of you can channel your joint signature directly into it, you may speed the healing by weeks. It is delicate work. It will require you to be... She paused, choosing the word, closely attuned, in accord. Pollux was emphatic on that point. Discord at the junction could do more harm than good. When? Hermione said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Tomorrow at first light. The wards are quietest then. McGonagall rose, and at the threshold she stopped, and for a moment her sharp eyes moved between the two of them with an expression Hermione couldn't read at all. Rest tonight, she said. Both of you. You'll need to trust one another in the morning. I don't pretend to know how matters stand between you, but I'd advise you not to spend the night refracturing what you've mended. And she was gone. The door clicked shut, the fire burned low, and they were alone again, with the thing that had almost happened still hanging in the air between them like the scent of ozone after a hex. Neither of them spoke of it. That was the unbearable, the necessary thing. To speak of it would be to make it real, to take it out of the safe dark of almost and into the merciless light of did, and neither of them was ready for that. So Draco said, I'll take the first watch on the fire, which made no sense, There was no watch to take, and Hermione said, "Fine," which made no sense either, and they retreated to their separate chairs and sat in the amber dark with 20 feet of silence between them and the ghost of his fingertips still burning on her cheek. She did not sleep well. The bond she was learning did not like the distance of separate rooms. It tolerated it, but it strained. A low, constant ache behind the breastbone like a muscle held too long in one position. Sometime past midnight, she gave up on sleep and lay listening through the wall, and heard, as she had that first night, the rough, uneven scrape of a breath that would not steady. This time she understood it differently. First light came thin and cold. They walked down to the 3rd floor in silence. McGonagall and Pollux ahead, the two of them following, the proper distance between them, the morning hush of the castle pressing close on every side. The junction, when they reached it, was a place where 4 corridors met beneath a high vaulted ceiling, and Hermione could see the damage at once, even without the diagnostic threads. The stone here was wrong. The angles didn't hold true. A doorway leaned 3 degrees off plumb. The flagstones rippled underfoot like a frozen tide, and the air tasted of cold iron and something burnt. The fracture runs from here. Pollux gestured at a great seam in the floor where the stone had buckled, up through the vault and into the 3rd floor lattice. You will stand on either side of the seam. You will join your magic, wands touching. This is old work. It wants the contact. And you will pour your concord into the break, slowly, together, until the stone remembers its true shape. He fixed them both with his squint. Together is the word that matters. If your signatures pull against each other in there, you will not heal the seam. You will widen it. And the ceiling above us, he glanced up at the great groaning vault, is not in a forgiving mood. Hermione looked at the buckled stone and at the leaning vault and at Draco across the seam and felt fear move cold through her stomach. "Wands," Pollux said. They stepped to either side of the fracture. Draco raised his wand, and she raised hers, and they brought the tips together over the broken seam. A small click of contact, hawthorn against vinewood, and at the touch the bond flared bright and immediate, that low, warm presence surging up between them until she could feel his pulse as clearly as her own, his fear and her fear braiding together into a single thrumming line. "Now," Pollux said, "slowly, find the accord. Hold it." Hermione closed her eyes and reached for the magic. It was unlike anything she had ever worked. There was no incantation, no wand movement, only the pouring of self, and the self she poured was not hers alone. She felt Draco's signature meet hers over the broken stone, felt the two of them sink together into the fracture, and for a moment it held, the gold light welling up from the seam, the stone beginning, with a deep, grinding groan, to ease back toward true. And then she felt him falter. It was small, a flicker of resistance, deep down, a flinch he couldn't help. And she understood it instantly, because she could feel the shape of it through the bond. He was afraid of this, of the joining, of how completely it laid him open, of her being able to feel him this way. And the moment he flinched, the gold light stuttered, and the seam in the floor gave a sharp lurch wider, and a chunk of vault stone the size of a cauldron tore loose above them and dropped. "Move!" Pollux shouted, hauling McGonagall back. But Hermione didn't move. She held the wand contact, held Draco's frightened eyes across the buckling stone, and did the only thing she could think to do. She stopped trying to push her magic into the seam and instead pushed it toward him, toward the flinch, the way you'd put your hand over someone's hand to steady it. "I'm here," she thought, with everything she had, knowing he could feel it through the line. "I'm not going anywhere. Let me in. I'm here." She felt the exact moment he stopped fighting. It was like a held breath let out across her whole body. The flinch dissolved. His signature opened to hers, not pushed, not pulled, but given, and the two of them poured together into the broken stone as one single thing, and the falling vault stone halted in mid-air, caught in a net of gold light. Neither of them had cast on purpose, and hung there, and then drifted, gently, impossibly, back up into the ceiling to settle into the seam it had fallen from. The fracture in the floor sealed itself with a sound like a great sigh. The leaning doorway righted itself, the rippled flagstone smoothed. The cold iron taste left the air, and in its place came something clean and warm, like sunlight on stone. And then it was over, and they were standing on either side of a perfectly whole floor, with their wands still touching and their chests heaving, staring at one another with naked astonishment. Merlin's beard, Pollux breathed, from where he'd flattened himself against the wall. He came forward slowly, gazing up at the seamless vault. "I have never, in 30 years of warding, I have never seen a junction close like that. That wasn't reinforcement. That was—" He shook his head, lost for the word. That was as if it had never broken at all. McGonagall said nothing. But she was looking at the two of them, at their still touching wands, the way neither of them had yet stepped back, and her expression had gone strange and soft and a little sad. Hermione lowered her wand. Draco lowered his. The point of contact broke, and she felt the small loss of it like a thread snapping. "You let me in," she said quietly, only to him. The others might as well have been on the moon. Draco's throat worked. "I didn't decide to," he said. "I couldn't, once you—" He stopped. His hand had curled around his wand so tightly the knuckles stood white, and she understood that the white-knuckled grip was not anger now, had perhaps never only been anger, that it was the way he held himself together when something inside him had come loose. "I have never let anyone do that," he said, very low. "Feel me. Like that. I didn't know it was—" He couldn't finish. "I know," Hermione said. "I felt it too." They did not speak much for the rest of the day. There was too much to say, and no safe way to begin saying it. But something had altered between them, fundamentally, the way a key alters when it has finally been cut to fit a lock. The same metal, but now with purpose, now with the capacity to open. That evening, the bond was quiet in a way it had never been. Hermione noticed it as she sat by the fire, that the low ache of separation she'd grown used to had eased into something almost like contentment, a warm, steady presence she no longer had to strain to hear. The castle, too, was quiet. No groaning stone, no shivering glass, just the crack of the fire and the soft patter of a new rain beginning against the tall window. Draco sat across from her, as he always did, but tonight he was not reading. He was watching the rain and the firelight, and, when he thought she wasn't looking, her. "Ask me," he said suddenly. She looked up. "Ask you what?" what you asked me last night, whether it's the bond. He didn't look away from the fire. His profile was very still. You said, tell you I feel nothing, and you'd believe me. I couldn't say it. I want... His jaw tightened. I want you to understand why. Hermione set her book aside. Her heart had begun to thud against her ribs, a slow, heavy beat. Tell me then. He was silent for a long moment. The rain came down. When he spoke, the words came slow, dragged up from somewhere deep and long buried. When you held the seam this morning, he said, when you put your magic over mine to steady it, I felt... He stopped, started again. All my life I have been taught that to be open is to be weak, that the thing inside you, the soft thing, the true thing, you guard it, you armor it, you never ever let it be seen, because the world will use it to break you. My father taught me that. His father taught him. His voice had gone rough. And then, this morning, a witch I was raised to despise reached across a broken floor and put her hand over the softest part of me, and instead of breaking it, she held it. She steadied it, and the world didn't end. The ceiling didn't fall. It healed. He turned, finally, and looked at her, and his eyes were bright in the firelight. Do you understand? Everything I was ever taught said that what you did this morning should have destroyed me, and it didn't. It saved us both. Hermione couldn't breathe. The rain ran in silver streaks down the dark glass. The fire threw its amber light across the small warm room, across the space between their two chairs that had felt, for days, like a chasm, and felt now like nothing at all, like a single step. She rose. She crossed it. She knelt by his chair, and she reached out, slowly, giving him every chance to pull away. And she took his hand, the one clenched white around nothing, and she opened his fingers, one by one, and laced hers through them. His hand was cold. It trembled. The bond between them sang, low and bright and sweet, and the fire crackled, and somewhere far below the cracked wardstones of the castle glowed gold and held. Then stop being afraid of it, she whispered. Let me hold it. I'm not going to break it. I'm right here. His other hand came up, and this time it did not hover, did not tremble in the air an inch from her skin. This time his fingers slid into her hair, warm and certain, drawing her up toward him as he leaned down, and his eyes fell to her mouth, and hers to his, and the space between them narrowed to a breath, to a heartbeat, to nothing at all. He stopped a breath away. Hermione felt his hesitation as clearly as she felt his hand in her hair. A held stillness, his mouth poised over hers, his eyes searching her face one last time, as though even now, even here, he could not quite believe he was permitted. The fire snapped, the rain ran down the glass, and in that suspended, aching moment, she understood that he was waiting, not out of doubt about himself, but out of a terror of getting it wrong, of reaching for the one good thing and finding it had been a mistake all along. So she closed the distance herself. It was the softest pressure imaginable, her mouth against his, tentative, a question more than an answer. And for one suspended instant, he went utterly still beneath it, as though he could not believe the thing was real. And then something in him broke open, and his hand tightened in her hair, and he kissed her back with a hunger that had clearly been starving for longer than either of them had admitted. And the bond between them, that low taut wire strung behind both their ribs, went silent. Not strained silent, not the brittle quiet of held breath. Resolved silent, the way a chord resolves, the way a long-held dissonance finally finds its home. Hermione made a small sound against his mouth and felt him answer it, felt his free hand come up to cradle the side of her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with a tenderness so at odds with everything she'd believed about him that it undid her completely. He tasted of the dark tea he drank and of something warmer underneath, and his fingers in her hair were not gentle now, but they were not cruel either. They were certain. They held her like a man who had decided, finally, to stop running. When they broke apart, they did not go far. Their foreheads came together. They breathed the same air. His eyes stayed closed, and his hand stayed in her hair, and the fire painted them both in amber, and neither of them spoke, because there were no words that would not have made it smaller. "The castle's quiet," she whispered at last. A breath of laughter moved through him, warm against her lips. "Is that what you're thinking about? Right now?" "I'm thinking," she said, "that nothing broke. We're closer than we've ever been, and nothing broke." She drew back just far enough to look at him. "It's not the distance, Draco. It was never really the distance. It's the resistance. The bond doesn't shake the castle when we pull apart in space. It shakes it when we pull apart in here." She pressed her palm flat to his chest over the steady thud of his heart. "And right now, neither of us is pulling away from anything." He covered her hand with his. His eyes had opened, grey and bright and disarmed. "No," he agreed very quietly. "We're not." The peace lasted 3 days. They were the strangest, sweetest 3 days of Hermione's life. A kind of suspended grace, the two of them sealed in the turret and the slow work of the wards, learning each other anew. The tether had lengthened so far now, fed on their unbroken accord, that they could move through nearly the whole 8th floor without strain. But they did not use the room they'd been granted. They stayed close by choice. They read in the same chair now, his arm around her, her feet tucked beneath her, the dry, sweet smell of old vellum mixing with the warmth of him. He told her things he had never told anyone, about the long, terrible year of the war, the things he'd been made to watch, the cowardice that had not felt like a choice at the time and felt like nothing else since. She told him about the scar, finally, the whole of it, and he listened without once trying to absolve himself. And when she had finished, he took her wrist very gently and pressed his lips to the carved word, and neither of them said anything at all. The castle thrived. Pollux came daily, and each day his squint grew more astonished. The nexus was healing at a rate he had no precedent for. The frayed gold of the lattice knit itself smooth. Junctions that had been buckled for months eased back into true. "Whatever the two of you are doing," he said on the 3rd day, rolling up his diagnostics with something like reverence, "do not stop doing it. At this rate, the bond may release you within the week." It was meant to be good news. Hermione watched it land on Draco's face and saw, for the first time in 3 days, the shutters begin to come down. She understood why before he said a word. She felt it through the bond, a cold thread of fear winding up through the warmth, the old taut terror reasserting itself the moment the safety of compulsion was threatened. As long as the bond held them, his being here was not a choice he could be blamed for. It was the magic's doing. He could let himself want this, because wanting it cost him nothing. The leash made the wanting safe. But if the bond released them, then staying would be a choice. Then wanting her would be a thing he had decided, nakedly, with no magic to hide behind. And if he chose it, and it went wrong, he would have no one to blame but the soft, true thing inside him that he had spent his whole life being taught to armor. "Draco," she said carefully that evening, when Pollux had gone and the fire had burned low. "Talk to me. There's nothing to talk about." He was at the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. The rain had stopped. Beyond the glass, the grounds lay silver under a half-moon. "You heard him." "We're nearly free." "Free," she repeated. "Isn't that what you wanted? From the start?" His voice had gone flat and careful, the old voice, the armored one. A way out, an end date, a horizon. You said it yourself that first morning. That was before. Before what, Granger? And he turned, and the shutters were all the way down now, his face a careful mask, and only the white-knuckled grip of his hand on the windowsill betrayed that the mask was costing him everything. Before 3 days? Before a kiss? You think 3 days undoes a lifetime? You think because the magic tied us together, and we made the best of a cage, that means... He stopped himself. His jaw worked. We were never going to be anything but what the bond made us. You know that. You're too clever not to know that. It was cruel, and it was meant to be. And she understood with a sick lurch exactly what he was doing. He was reaching for the oldest weapon he owned, hurting her on purpose so that she would pull away first, so that the ending would be her doing and not his, so that he could lose her without ever having to admit he'd chosen to. "You don't believe that," she said quietly. "Don't tell me what I believe." "Then prove it." She stood. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady, and she was suddenly, coldly furious. Not at him, but at the year that had made him, at the men who had taught him that the only safe love was the kind you could blame on something else. If it's only the bond, then it won't matter, will it? When the magic lets us go, we'll feel nothing. We'll walk away, so let's stop guessing. She crossed the room toward him. "I'll ask McGonagall to test it. The full separation. Tomorrow. And then we'll know, Draco. No more hiding behind the leash. We'll find out exactly what's the magic and what's us." The colour had drained from his face. "Don't." "Why not? You just said we're nothing but what the bond made us, so a separation should cost you nothing." She was close now, close enough to see the panic in his eyes, the thing he was trying so hard to bury. "Unless you're afraid of what we'll find." "Granger, tell me you're not afraid, and I'll drop it." He couldn't. She watched him fail to, watched the words die in his throat, watched his whole carefully built defense come apart at the seams. And just as something in his face began, finally to give way, just as his mouth opened on what might have been the truth, the door to the round room burst open without a knock, and a breathless first year in Gryffindor colours stood there clutching the frame, white-faced, his eyes huge. "Miss Granger, please, you have to come. The headmistress said, get you both, the third-floor junction, the one you fixed. Something's wrong with it. The whole corridor's..." And from far below, faint and terrible, came a sound Hermione knew too well. The deep, groaning shriek of stone tearing against its own true shape, and beneath it, threading up through the floor and into her own chest, where the bond lay quiet, a cold and growing tremor that had not been there a moment before. They ran. Down the spiral stairs, through the dark corridors, the first year sprinting ahead of them, and the castle shuddering around them with every step. And Hermione understood, with a cold clarity that grew worse the closer they came, that the tremor was not in the stone. It was in them, in the bond. The discord that had bloomed in the round room when Draco reached for cruelty had not stayed in the round room. It had poured out through the tether and down into the very junction they'd healed 3 days before. And now the mended seam was tearing itself open again along the exact line of their own fracture. The third-floor corridor was chaos. The flagstones had buckled worse than before, heaving like a sea caught mid-swell. The great vault groaned overhead, hairline cracks racing across it in real time, dust sifting down in pale curtains. McGonagall stood at the corridor's mouth with her wand raised, holding back a knot of frightened students, and Pollux crouched over his diagnostics with his face the colour of old wax. "What did you do?" he said, looking up at them as they arrived. The junction was perfect, stable, and then 4 minutes ago it began to... He gestured helplessly at the tearing stone. The fracture is reopening along the same seam, as if the healing has reversed. "It's us," Hermione said. Her chest was heaving, and not only from the running. We quarrelled. Just now, upstairs." She looked at Draco, who had gone very still and very pale beside her. "The discord. It poured into the junction we joined our magic to. We made that seam ours, Pollux. We put ourselves into it. And now it's tearing the way we're tearing." "Then untear," Pollux snapped. "Whatever you did 3 days ago, do it again. Now. Before the vault comes down on a corridor full of children." Above them, a section of the ceiling sagged with a long shriek, and a slab the size of a door tore halfway free and hung, groaning, by a thread of crumbling stone. The students screamed. McGonagall's shield charm flared up to span the corridor, but Hermione could see the strain in the old witch's face, see that no shield would hold for long against a whole collapsing vault. "Wands," Hermione said, turning to Draco. "Like before. Come on." But he didn't move. He stood frozen at the edge of the buckling stone, his wand in his hand but not raised, staring at the tearing seam with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not fear, exactly, but something worse, a kind of paralysis. The look of a man standing at the lip of a drop he's been falling toward his whole life. "Draco." She grabbed his wrist. "Draco, we have to join. Now!" "I can't." His voice was a thread. "Granger, I can't. What I felt this morning, if I open like that again, His hand was shaking. The slab above them groaned. "What if it's true?" he whispered, and the words were torn out of him, raw and terrified and naked. "What if we heal it again, and then the bond lets us go, and you walk away, and I've laid the whole of myself open to you for nothing, and I have to live the rest of my life knowing exactly what it felt like to be." He couldn't finish. His knuckles were white around the wand. "I don't know how to do this if it isn't safe. I've never once done it when it wasn't safe." And Hermione understood, in that suspended, terrible second with the ceiling coming down around them, that this was the whole of it, the entire war he'd been fighting since the gold light first took. Not whether he wanted her. He wanted her. that had stopped being in question days ago. The war was whether he could choose to be open when there was no compulsion left to blame, no leash to make the wanting safe, no magic to hide his soft, true self behind. He could love her as long as the bond made him. He did not know how to love her as a choice, so she did the only thing she could think to do. She let go of his wrist. She stepped back, one deliberate pace, then another, the tether straining, the seam tearing wider, the slab shrieking overhead. And she put space between them on purpose, more space than they'd allowed in days. And the discord howled through the bond, and the vault gave a sound like the world ending. "What are you doing?" Pollux shouted. "Showing him," Hermione said, and her voice did not shake, though everything in her was screaming. She kept her eyes on Draco's, only Draco's, across the widening gulf. "Look at me. The bond's not making me do this. Listen to me, Draco. There's no magic holding me here right now. I've stepped out of its reach. It's pulling me to walk away, and I'm not walking away." She took one step back toward him, against the strain, against the tether, against everything the leash was demanding. "I'm choosing it. Do you understand? Right now, with nothing forcing me, I'm choosing you. That's what's safe. Not the bond. Me. I'm what's safe. I'm choosing it. And I'd choose it if the bond vanished this second. And I'll keep choosing it tomorrow, when McGonagall tests the separation and the magic lets us go. Because it was never the leash, Draco. It was never the cage. It was always, always. The slab tore free. It dropped, straight down toward the knot of children, toward McGonagall's failing shield. And in the half-second before it fell, Hermione saw Draco move, not toward safety, toward her. He crossed the buckling floor in 2 strides and seized her hand and brought his wand up to touch hers in the same motion, and she felt him open, felt him tear down every armor he owned, all of it, all at once. No flinch, no hesitation, the softest, truest part of him flung wide for her to hold. And his magic poured into hers, not because the bond demanded it, but because he had chosen it, finally, freely, with the world coming down around them. The gold light detonated up from the seam. It caught the falling slab. It caught the whole tearing vault. And this time, it did not merely halt the stone. It flooded the junction, brilliant and warm and singing, pouring through every crack and fracture in the corridor at once. And the buckled flagstones smoothed, and the leaning walls stood true, and the cracks in the ceiling sealed themselves with a sound like a great indrawn breath, and the slab drifted up, gentle as a falling leaf reversed, and settled home, and the gold light kept spreading, out of the junction, into the floor, into the walls, racing through the whole lattice of the castle's wards, mending as it went, every frayed thread, every old break, the war's whole accumulated damage, knitting smooth in a single golden tide. And then it was still. The corridor was whole. The children were staring, open-mouthed, untouched. Pollux had sat down hard on the flagstones and was gazing at his diagnostics with tears standing in his eyes. McGonagall lowered her wand slowly, her face gone soft with something that might have been awe, and might have been grief, and might have been both. And Draco and Hermione stood in the centre of the healed corridor, with their wands touching and their hands clasped, and the bond singing between them. And Draco was looking at her as though he had just woken from a long, terrible dream into the first real morning of his life. "It was never the leash," he said. His voice broke clean in half. "You said you stepped out of its reach and you came back. You came back when nothing was making you." "I told you," Hermione said. Her own eyes were wet now. "I'm what's safe." He let go of his wand. It clattered to the stone, forgotten. And he took her face in both his hands. Both of them, no hovering, no trembling, no inch of careful distance held in reserve. And he kissed her, there in the corridor full of staring children and weeping warders and astonished portraits. Kissed her like a man who had finally, after a lifetime of being taught otherwise, decided that the soft, true thing inside him was not a weakness to be armored, but the only part of him worth saving. The bond between them went silent, resolved. Home. And from the deep heart of the castle, from the undercroft where the cracked wardstones had glowed and dimmed and glowed for so many months, there rose a single, deep, resonant note. Not a groan of tearing stone, not the shiver of breaking glass, but something Hermione had never heard the castle make before. A long, low, golden hum, warm as sunlight, vast as the building itself, as though the ancient school had been holding its breath for 1,000 years and had only now, at last, let it go. I'll set the images aside. They don't add to a voice-over-ready text. The story continues. When McGonagall finally spoke, her voice was not quite steady. "The Nexus is whole," she said, looking at her own hands as though she didn't trust them. "Not reinforced, not splintered, whole. The damage of the entire war, gone in a single." She stopped. She looked at the two of them, still standing forehead to forehead in the middle of the corridor, and something in her sharp old face gentled past all recognition. "I think," she said, "the rest of you ought to come away now and let these two have a moment. Off you go. Lessons. Lessons," I said. And she herded the gaping students away down the mended corridor, and Pollux gathered up his diagnostics with shaking hands and followed, casting one last awed glance back over his shoulder, until at last the two of them were alone in the golden hush of the healed stone. Hermione drew back just far enough to look at him. "You came toward me," she said. "The slab was falling, and you came toward me." "Where else would I go?" Draco said simply. And the simplicity of it, the way the thing he'd spent a lifetime believing impossible, had become, in a single instant, the most obvious truth in the world, broke something open in her chest that she hadn't known was still closed. They walked back up to the turret slowly, hand in hand, the proper distance forgotten, unneeded. The bond no longer strained against the space between them, because there was no space between them, and no resistance left in either of them to strain. Through every window, the morning was coming up gold over the grounds, the lake throwing back the light, the rain-washed stone of the ancient castle gleaming as though newly made. At the door of the round room, he stopped, his hand on the latch, exactly as he had on that first terrible night. But everything had changed, and they both knew it. "Tomorrow," he said, "when McGonagall tests the separation. When the magic lets us go." He turned to face her, and there was no armor left in him at all. None. Only the open and the true. "I'll still be here. Bond or no bond. Leash or no leash. I want you to know that before the test, not after. I want you to know I'm choosing it now, while it still costs me something to say." Hermione smiled and reached up and laid her palm against his cheek. "I know," she said. "I've known since you came toward me." And he turned his face into her hand and pressed his lips to her palm, and the golden hum of the castle rose around them both like a held note, finally, gladly released. And outside the great window, over the broken and the mended world alike, the morning came on warm and clear and entirely without a single shadow of a storm. The test came at dawn, as McGonagall had promised, in the long gallery on the 8th floor, where they had measured the tether's first cruel limits a lifetime of days ago. Hermione had not slept. Neither, she suspected, had Draco. They had spent the night in the round room, not talking much, sitting close by the fire with his arm around her and her head against his shoulder, watching the embers fall to ash and the dark window pale toward grey. There had been a peace in it, but underneath the peace ran a current of something neither of them named, the knowledge that in the morning the magic would finally answer the question that had haunted them from the start. How much of this is the bond, and how much is us? Pollux arrived with his diagnostics. McGonagall came with her sharp eyes and her unreadable face. The gallery stretched away between them, the portraits stirring sleepily in their frames, the great window at the far end streaming with the first thin gold of sunrise. "You understand what we're testing," Pollux said. He had recovered his squint, but there was a new gentleness in him now, the wariness of a man who had watched something he could not explain and decided to revere it. "The nexus is whole. By every measure I possess, the bond's work is done. There is nothing left for it to splint, nothing left to heal. Which means the tether should, by all the laws I know, have released you in the night." He paused. "But it hasn't. The two of you are still bound, still resonant. And I confess, I cannot tell you whether that is because the magic has not yet caught up to the healing, or because the bond has become something else, something it has no instructions to dissolve." Hermione's heart was beating hard. "So, how do we find out?" "You separate, fully, farther than you've ever gone." Pollux gestured down the long gallery and then to the door at its far end. "If it's still the old tether, the splint, the leash, the magic that shakes the castle when you part, then you'll feel the strain begin within a few paces, and the windows will warn you, and will know the bond still holds you against your nature." He hesitated. "But if you can walk to opposite ends of this gallery, and through those doors, and out of each other's sight, and nothing breaks, then the leash is gone. Whatever holds you, now holds you because you wish it to, and you'll be free to walk away from one another entirely, with no harm to anyone." The word free hung in the air. A week ago, it had been the only word Hermione wanted. Now it sat cold in her stomach. Draco took her hand. His was steady. "Whatever it shows," he said, low only for her. "It changes nothing I said yesterday. I know. Whatever the magic does, I'm choosing it. I'll keep choosing it. The test is for them." A tilt of his head at Pollux and McGonagall. "Not for us. We already know." She pressed his fingers once, hard, and let go. They walked to the centre of the gallery and stood back to back, and on Pollux's word they began to walk apart. The first few paces were easy, 5 feet, 10. Hermione's footsteps echoed in the long hollow space, hers and his moving in opposite directions, the distance opening between them like a wound being slowly stretched. She kept her eyes on the door ahead, and waited for the old familiar strain. The low bell note of warning, the shiver in the glass, the cold pressure building behind her ribs where the bond lay. 15 feet, 20, the old limit, the place where the painted witch on her grey horse had begun to ripple and the window had cracked. Nothing happened. The portrait slept on. The window held. The air stayed warm and still. Hermione's breath caught. 25 feet. 30. She could feel him behind her, that low, warm presence at the edge of her awareness. But it was not straining, not pulling, not screaming to be answered. It was simply there, steady and content, a second heartbeat keeping time with her own across the widening gulf. 40 feet, the length of the gallery. She reached the door at her end and put her hand on the latch and turned and looked back down the long golden space. And Draco stood at the far door looking back at her, tiny with distance, his pale hair catching the sunrise, and the whole vast room lay quiet and whole between them. "Through the doors," Pollux called, his voice gone tight. "Out of sight, both of you. Now." Hermione opened the door and stepped through, into the corridor beyond, and let it swing shut behind her. And she was alone. For the first time in 11 days, she stood entirely beyond the reach of the bond, out of his sight, out of the gallery, the full length of the castle's longest room, and a closed door between them. And the magic did not howl, and the stone did not groan, and no window in all the castle so much as trembled. The tether did not snap her back. It did not punish the distance. It simply held, loose now, slack. A thread with all the give in the world, connecting 2 points that no longer needed to be near, because the nearness had become a thing they carried inside themselves rather than a leash strung between them. She could feel him still. That was the wonder of it. Beyond the door, beyond the gallery, that low, warm presence remained, faint but unbroken. Not the bond's compulsion, but something quieter and far more frightening. The simple, chosen knowledge of where he was, and that he was hers. She heard Pollux's voice through the door, faint and astonished. "Released. The leash it's released. They could be in different counties. And the resonance, headmistress, the resonance is still there. The bond's compulsion is gone, but the bond itself, it remains. There's no precedent." "There's a precedent," McGonagall said, and even through the door Hermione could hear the smile in it, a rare and crooked thing. "It's simply not one you'll find in your diagnostics, Warder Pollux. Open the doors. Let them back in. I rather think they'll want to be." The doors opened. Hermione stepped back into the gallery, and at the far end Draco stepped back in too, and they stood looking at one another down the length of the golden room. 40 feet of empty space between them, and not a single thing forcing them to cross it. And they crossed it. They met in the centre, where they had stood back to back 5 minutes and a whole lifetime ago. And Draco took her face in his hands and rested his forehead against hers. And they stood there, breathing the same air in the sunrise, while Pollux babbled about precedents and McGonagall pretended to study the ceiling. "It let us go," Draco murmured. "It let us go," Hermione agreed. "And here we are. Here we are." His thumbs moved on her cheekbones. His eyes were wet and bright and entirely unarmoured. "Free to walk away, and I have never in my life wanted anything less." She laughed, a small, broken, overflowing sound, and rose up on her toes and kissed him, slow and certain and unhurried, with no catastrophe falling around them, and no compulsion driving them, and nothing in all the world holding them together except the choice to be held. The bond hummed between them, soft and content, a chord with nothing left to resolve. Word spread, of course, the way it always did at Hogwarts, through the portraits first, then the house elves, then the breathless retellings of the third-floor children who had watched the corridor heal itself in a tide of gold. By breakfast, the great hall was full of stolen glances and whispered speculation. By lunch, the speculation had become certainty. By evening, when Draco Malfoy walked into the hall and crossed without hesitation and in full view of 4 house tables to sit beside Hermione Granger at the Gryffindor bench, the certainty became something close to legend. It was not easy after. Nothing real ever was. There were stares and mutters and the particular cruelty of people who had decided long ago who each of them was and could not forgive them for becoming otherwise. There were the old friends who didn't understand, the long letters of explanation, the careful conversations with Harry and Ron that began stiff and wary and softened over weeks into something Hermione could live with. There were nights when the war came back to one or the other of them in dreams, and the old armor tried to rise, and they had to learn, slowly, deliberately, the way they had learned everything, how to reach across the dark and steady, the soft, frightened thing in the other, rather than letting it harden. But the castle never shook again. That was the thing Pollux could never quite get over in the months that followed, as he wrote up his impossible findings for a department that would never fully believe them. The nexus held perfectly. The wards stayed whole. And the 2 anchors who had once threatened to bring the whole school down around their ears walked its corridors freely now, sometimes together and sometimes apart, sometimes at opposite ends of the grounds. And not a single pane of glass ever cracked, not a single flagstone ever buckled, because there was no resistance left in either of them for the old magic to translate into ruin. They had stopped pulling away. And on a warm evening, late in spring, when the lake lay gold under the setting sun, and the rebuilt towers of the castle stood whole and gleaming against a sky without a single cloud, Hermione Granger sat by the water with Draco Malfoy's head in her lap and her fingers in his pale hair, and felt the low, warm presence of him steady beneath her hand and steady inside her chest, and understood, with a quiet that had no fear left in it at all, that some bonds are not cages, that some bonds are not cages but choices made again and again in the small ordinary moments that no magic could ever have compelled. The spring deepened into summer, and the summer carried them out of the castle and into the world. It was a strange thing, leaving Hogwarts. For 11 days it had been a prison, for the months after a sanctuary, and now, on the morning the last carriages waited on the gravel drive to carry the 8th years away for the final time, it was simply the place where the 2 of them had become themselves. Hermione stood at the great doors with her trunk beside her and looked back up at the rebuilt towers, at the high windows catching the early light, and felt the old building hum once more beneath her feet, that low golden note it had given the day the corridor healed, the sound it made now whenever she and Draco stood together within its walls. "It's saying goodbye," Draco said, coming up beside her. He had heard it too. He always heard it now. "It's saying thank you," Hermione corrected and threaded her fingers through his. McGonagall saw them off herself, which she did not do for everyone. She stood on the steps in her tartan travelling cloak, her sharp eyes moving between the two of them with an expression that had grown, over the long months, from suspicion to something near to fondness. "I'll be plain," she said, in the way that meant she was about to be anything but. "When the castle paired the two of you, I thought it had made a grievous error. I thought I would spend the year managing a catastrophe." She paused. "I was wrong. The castle knew something I did not. It usually does." Her mouth twitched. "It read resonance," Pollux said. "The depth of the answer one signature gives another. I have come to believe it was reading rather more than magic." She extended her hand to each of them in turn, firm and dry. "Go well, both of you, and do come back and visit. The old stones are fond of you. I find, to my considerable surprise, that I am too." And that was all the sentiment she would permit herself. She turned on her heel and swept back into the castle, and the great doors closed behind her, and the two of them walked down the steps and away. The years did what years do. They unfolded. There was a flat in London first, small and crooked and entirely theirs, with a window that looked out over a tangle of rooftops, and a kitchen too narrow for two people who both wanted to make the tea. There was the slow, deliberate work of building lives that the war had nearly stolen. Hermione at the ministry, fighting the long, unglamorous fights that no one wrote ballads about, the ones that actually changed things. Draco, who had expected the world to never let him be anything but his father's son, finding, to his own astonishment, a gift for the healing arts, for the patient mending of magical injuries, the kind of work that asked a man to open the soft, true part of himself and steady another's pain with it. He was good at it. He had, it turned out, been practicing for years without knowing. There were the old wounds still that surfaced sometimes in the dark. Hermione learned the particular stillness that came over him on the anniversaries he never spoke of, and learned not to fill the silence, but to sit inside it with him until it passed. Draco learned the way her hand would drift, unthinking, to her left forearm when she was frightened, and learned to take that hand in both of his and hold it, the way she had once opened his clenched fist by the fire, finger by finger, until the fear let go. They were not always gentle with each other. They were both too proud, too sharp, too thoroughly themselves for that. But the old catastrophe never returned. Not the shaking, not the breaking, not the cold pressure of two people pulling away, because they had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the only thing that had ever done them harm was the pulling away itself, and they had simply, deliberately decided to stop. The bond remained. Pollux had been right. It had no instructions to dissolve, and so it never did. They could be in different counties, different countries. Hermione spent a fortnight in Australia once, restoring the memories she had taken from her parents, and Draco felt her the whole time, that low, warm presence, steady at the edge of his awareness, across all the leagues of ocean between them. It was not a leash. It had not been a leash for a very long time. It was a thread, slack and golden and unbreakable. And when she came home through the international flu with her parents' faces lit with a recognition she had given back to them, he was waiting on the other side, and the thread drew taut and bright and singing as she stepped into his arms. And somewhere very far away, in a castle in the Highlands, the old stones hummed. He asked her on an ordinary evening, which was the only kind of evening he could have asked her on, because they had both had quite enough of catastrophes for one lifetime. It was raining. Of course, it was raining. The rain had threaded through the whole of their story, the storm against the turret glass on that first terrible night, the silver runnels down the gallery windows, the rinsed clean mornings after. They were in the crooked flat, and the rain came soft against the window, and Hermione was reading in the chair by the lamp, with her feet tucked beneath her, and a quill ruined between her teeth. And Draco was watching her over the top of his own book, exactly as he had on that 5th evening in the round room, when the whole thing had cracked open between them. "You're staring," she said, without looking up. "I'm wondering," he said, "how one person can frown at a book that hard without setting it alight." She did look up then, because they both knew the lines, because they had become a kind of liturgy between them, and she found him out of his chair and on one knee beside hers, and the book forgotten, and in his open palm, not hidden, not hovering, not trembling, but held out plainly in the lamplight where she could see it. A ring. It was old. She could tell at a glance that it was old, that it had a history, that it was not the kind of thing a Malfoy chose lightly. The silver of it caught the lamp, and against it sat a single pale stone that seemed to hold a low, warm light of its own. "It was my grandmother's," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "The only thing in that whole house I ever wanted. She was the one person who never taught me to be afraid of the soft thing. She died before the war. I think she'd have liked you. I think she'd have liked you enormously, which is more than I can say for the rest of them, and I find I no longer care what the rest of them would have thought." He drew a breath. "I had a speech. I had a very good speech. I've forgotten all of it." A crooked, helpless smile. "Granger, Hermione, I have spent my whole life being taught that to open yourself to another person is to hand them the means to destroy you. And then you reached across a broken floor and put your hand over the softest part of me, and instead of breaking it, you held it. You've been holding it ever since. There is no version of my life worth living that doesn't have you in it, holding it." He turned the ring so the stone caught the light. "I'm choosing it. I'll keep choosing it. Marry me, and I'll choose it every day for the rest of my life, while it still costs me something to say." Hermione could not speak. Her eyes had filled, and her hand had risen to her mouth, and the quill had fallen forgotten to the floor. She did not need to speak. She had learned, over all these years, that the truest things between them had never been said aloud, that they lived in the touches, the looks, the silences, the choosing. So she reached out and took his face in both her hands, the way he had taken hers in the healed corridor with the whole castle gone gold around them, and she pressed her forehead to his, and she breathed the same air he breathed, and she felt the bond between them draw taut and bright and singing. that low golden note rising up through both their chests as though some far-off castle in the Highlands had heard, across all the miles, and was humming its blessing into the rain's soft dark. "Yes," she whispered, finally against his mouth. "Yes, of course, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and the cool silver settled against her skin, warm in an instant with the heat of her hand. And he kissed her, slow and certain and unhurried, the way he had learned to kiss her in the firelight of a round room in a turret a lifetime ago, with no catastrophe falling and no compulsion driving, and nothing in all the wide world holding them together except the long, deliberate daily choice to be held. Outside, the rain came down soft over the rooftops of the sleeping city. The lamp burned warm and gold in the crooked little flat, and in the place behind both their ribs, where a fractured magic had once been forced to live, there was now only the quiet, resolved, contented home, the silence of a chord that has finally, after long and difficult passage, found exactly the note it was always meant to sound. They had been bound against their will once. They had fought it with everything they had, and the fighting had nearly brought a castle down around them. And in the end, the lesson had been so simple that it had taken them 11 days and a falling ceiling to learn it, that the magic had never been the cage. The resistance had been the cage. And the moment they stopped pulling away, the moment they turned, each of them, toward the other and chose, the bond had stopped being a leash and become the truest kind of freedom there is. The kind you walk into with your eyes open, the kind you choose and go on choosing every ordinary day for the whole of one wild and golden life.
So that was the story. Thank you for staying with me to the end. I want to tell you why I wrote it. I think we all have a soft part inside us, a true part, and most of us learn to hide it. We build walls, we tell ourselves that walls keep us safe. Draco believed that too. He was thought that to open your heart is to be weak, that someone will use it to break you. But then something happens in the story. Hermione reaches across a broken floor. She puts her hand over the softest part of him, and she does not break it. She holds it. That moment stayed with me because I think love is not a big loud thing. I think love is that it is someone holding the soft part of you gently and not letting go. The magic in the story was never the cage, the fear was the cage. They only found peace when they stopped pulling away, when they chose each other again and again, every ordinary day. Maybe you have a walk too. Maybe someone is waiting to hold your soft part. I hope you'll let them. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart, and I will see you in the next story.